Alan, we're going to start. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Muji.
My name's Robin.
We're twins, so we're trying to work with herbal medicines and medicinal fungi. Okay, so that's what we're doing, and the product that you're tasting now is a new product. It's a mushroom cola, and we'll talk through why and how. Why are you drinking that? Why is it a good idea to drink it? What are the limitations of fungi as medicinal supplements? It's going to be a very, very brief overview of mushrooms generally. They're getting more and more popular, and we want to know a little bit more and demystify fungi for those of you who are new to it. Anything else you want to say?
No.
Okay, you don't have to stand. You can sit. Is everyone comfortable? Everyone's comfortable, yeah?
Everybody but one by the looks of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What did you say?
You have to wait and find out, I guess.
Yeah.
Is it death cap?
No death caps. No. Yeah. Okay. So a quick introduction. So I'm a pharmacist, trained as a pharmacist 10 years ago. Then I trained as a medical herbalist, and then just come back from Sweden a couple of years ago. Finished training as a forest ecologist and sustainable forest manager, and I've just been working. He's got away. He's got just finished working with the Forestry Commission. Yeah, it's a good plan. If anyone wants to join, this is about mushrooms, so feel free to join. Mushrooms, medicine, and ecology. So I'm a forest ecologist. Finished studying and working in Sweden, and then I was working with the Forestry Commission last year until early this year. So that's a brief overview of me, and then Robin can give a brief introduction to herself.
Yeah. Okay, similar beginnings for me in terms of pharmacy. I think I've been an intuitive herbalist since I was a child. Also studied herbalism, and I'm also a birth keeper, or doula if you know that term more. I also work with mental health and well-being in a Steiner school in Nottingham.
Yeah, so this talk, we wanted to talk about what fungi are as their own kingdom. What function do they play in any ecosystem, in any given ecosystem? Why are they important, actually pivotal to a functioning healthy ecosystem? What does that look like? What does it mean? And then more specific species of fungi, how are they utilized by people for directly giving health? So medicinal species of mushroom will end, or the one half of the talk will be on medicinal species. So is everybody here? I don't know what the knowledge. Does everyone here know a little bit about mushrooms? Yeah, some things about mushrooms, not so much about mushrooms. Yeah, so if I go into some detail, and if I go into too much detail, we can just stop and pause and then move on to the next topic.
Perhaps that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, true. So some feedback would be good as well as we go, so that we're not losing anyone in the process. So fungi, its own kingdom. So if you look at the woodland, so this oak here. This oak will have roots extending 2-3 times the canopy of its canopy. It's extending outwards, so very, very likely it's sitting on top of the root system of this oak, or at least touching the root system of this oak. The root system itself can access. We know the roots are taking up water and nutrients from the soil. And that's only part of the story, so we don't really know. We weren't taught about fungi. Well, I was not taught about fungi as a child, and its role in allowing a plant to assimilate water and nutrients from the soil. So most plants, including these trees, are in a symbiotic relationship to fungi, ectomycorrhizal fungi in this case. It can be different types of fungi, but they are fungi which form a relationship with the root systems of any given plant. So in this case, if you were to dig up right underneath where you're sitting, take up the fine root hairs of this oak tree, you would find associated with it mycelial structures, a mycelial network, so hyphae. So this is belonging to a different organism. It isn't the organism of the oak tree. It's a fungal organism that's in direct relationship. Okay, and there are different ways to categorize those fungi, but we'll talk about that later. So what is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of having that relationship, that symbiotic relationship? What are they doing for each other and with each other? And so the reason is that the root system of the tree can only take up so much nutrients and so much water because of the surface area it's able to produce. So it's able to create a surface area, and at school we were taught that the fine root hairs increase the surface area somewhat, but still, to create that tree and to take up enough water and to assimilate enough nutrients from the soil, that isn't sufficient. So to improve that, it associates itself with these ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they're in contact with the roots, and they increase the surface area by up to, well, by 1,000-fold. So many degrees increase in the ability to take up water and take up nutrients. And we'll talk about nutrients and nutrient uptake in a little bit. In return, so fungi they do not photosynthesize, so they require a sugar, so they require carbon. When we talk about carbon allocation and carbon movement in forest ecosystems, we're usually talking about sugars. And sugar, so glucose is an example of sugar, but also cellulose, and so cellulose, different structural sugars, starches, these are all types of sugars, carbohydrates. So chemically speaking, you have different types of sugars. So sugars have to move, carbon has to move between organic components of an ecosystem for life to continue. So this is what's happening. So you get photosynthesis occurring in the leaves of the oak. The fungi itself cannot photosynthesize, so it doesn't generate its own sugars. It requires another source for the sugars. The oak tree releases sugars. So these are exudates, root exudates are released into the soil and directly to the mycorrhiza. So they feed the fungi, they feed the fungal system, little bit by little bit, like drips and drips of sugar, and that feeds the mycorrhiza, and that keeps it alive. And in return, the mycorrhiza opens up the soil structure by those orders of magnitude that I mentioned, and that improves the efficiency of uptake of nutrients and minerals and water for the tree. So that's the nature of the symbiotic relationship. It's quite an incredible relationship to have evolved, and when they do evolve, it's always in mutually beneficial manner. So that's the idea of a symbiotic relationship, is that it's mutually beneficial. And when they are not mutual, so in ecology we talk about different types of relationships, which is a really beautiful way to see the world, which we're not used to. So when we come to reductionist, mostly Western science and scientific methodology, we are breaking things down into their constituent components. And what that does is it helps us, and that's from the Greek tradition, that's from a very, very left hemisphere kind of reductionist way of viewing the world. So now I've just talked to you about an oak tree, but you never actually get an oak. You never just get an oak tree, really. So it's never just that. It's always many different organisms. There are about 1,000 different organisms that are associated with an oak, which is why they're such powerful players in a forest ecosystem. But what I mean to say is, we're very used to talking about individual components of a system or of an ecosystem. So that's why I would always encourage people to study ecology or think in ecological terms, because it helps us to see relationships rather than objects, discrete objects, and that's always very important. And it has implications on a social level. That's outside of the remit of this talk, but yeah, it has implications on a social level. So, looking back again at this beautiful oak, and you can see many other oaks behind it, they are all in communication with each other. Now, I think recently it's been, most people have probably heard that they're in communication with each other. What does that really mean? What does that look like? And I think sometimes it's romanticized, that relationship, but the fact is, and the fact remains, that the nutrient movement underground is regulated by the mycorrhizal network. Okay, so those trees, so in there's an oak sapling which is small. I don't know, there's going to be an oak sapling which is small and struggling to get light for photosynthesis because it's quite closed and quite dark. You can see the structure of the forest is a closed canopy there, inside there. It's quite dark. Oak needs light to regenerate. It's a mid-successional species, so it needs light. So that oak is going to stay at that height until a gap in the canopy opens up. But meanwhile, the larger, more successful oak trees will channel nutrients, and now we come into the idea of will, and we don't know if they have their own will. We don't know what that really means. So my language is loaded. But there's a channeling of nutrients, for example nitrogen, and we can trace that with isotopes of nitrogen, nitrogen-15. So we can trace nitrogen underground, and we can look at how mycorrhizal networks redistribute nitrogen from healthier trees to trees that would require that nitrogen, so it's more needed. And this is covered extensively by Suzanne Simard, I think that's how you say her name. Simard. So she talks about nutrient regulation and nutrient directionality when it comes to these interacting species. Okay, so the interesting thing is when it comes to different species. So if there's birch, there's a birch stand behind you. That's birch, and if there are oak birch forests, what happens then? So how do nutrients move between species? And they move also. So if an oak has a particular amount of nitrogen, an excess, let's just say it's never really like that, but in excess, it can move it to a small birch sapling. That's completely the case. So they don't see species competition as we know it. But rather, so they don't see individuals. They see rather the whole forest ecosystem, the functionality of the ecosystem, and the health of the ecosystem. So there are different ways of seeing, and the way to see forest health. So what does a healthy forest look like? Is probably very different to what we would think, coming from our own education and conditioning. Okay, I said a lot there. Does anyone have any questions on those topics? Is everyone okay with the little rain? Yeah? I only know how to do a rain dance. I don't know how to do the unrain dance. I have a coat. If anyone wants a coat, there's a coat behind. If anyone wants it, you're welcome to it. Does anyone have any questions on that aspect of mycelial ecology, we can call it, fungal ecology? Okay, good.
Sorry, can I just ask one?
Yeah.
You talked about communication, and you're talking about nitrogen and other nutrients being passed on to smaller trees.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it thought that smaller sapling is asking for it in some way, or demanding it, or? Excellent. How does that? What's our understanding of how that works?
Yeah, excellent question. So the gentleman asked, how does a deficient tree make its need known? And there is sensing involved. So I'll give you a good example. So if I had a crop or trees and I started to input nitrogen fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer, So this is a really good concept to take away with you when people talk about organic and inorganic, fertilizing, non-fertilizing. What does it actually do, and what does it mean for the sustainability of any given system? When I input synthetic nitrogen fertilizer into a system, the tree senses that it no longer needs to rely on a mycorrhizal source of nitrogen, which is where it was obtaining much of its nitrogen via the mycorrhizal. So that's the fungal network. It senses synthetic nitrogen, it takes up that synthetic nitrogen and utilizes it in its metabolism, no problem, fine, it works very well. But the tree or the plant will stop releasing exudates to the mycorrhiza. So that's called nitrogen mediated decoupling. Nitrogen mediated decoupling is when the tree realizes it's getting its nitrogen, and that's a key element that needs to be taken up. So it's a really good indicator for the tree to know whether the soil is good for it or not good for it. Stops taking up nitrogen via the mycelial network and stops feeding the mycelial structure with sugars. The mycelial structure dies, the mycelial network will die in that soil. Now there's a whole ecology in the soil, so related to bacteria, related to viruses. There's a whole ecology reliant on that mycorrhizal network. It isn't just that tree root and the mycelial, which is what the picture I'm painting for you now. It's incredibly complex, and the number of organisms, in one handful of soil are just, I think it's like more than the number of stars in the universe or something, some really cool fact like that. So it's really, I should know the fact. It's something like that. What I mean to say is it's an incredible array of organisms interacting, and the biology of the soil determines the chemistry of the soil, determines the fertility of the soil, determines the health of the plant. So when I input synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, decouple the mycelial network, in the short term, the tree is doing fine. When I stop inputting nitrogen fertilizer, that tree can no longer take up that nitrogen in the same way, because it's been decoupled from its normal source, or its more sustainable source, which is the mycelial network, the mushroom, the fungi. The fungi is no longer there, and it doesn't have means for it to be supported. So that soil, we call it dead soil. That's dead biologically, ecologically. That's dead soil, and you've actually put yourself into a loop of dependence, or a cycle of dependence on synthetic fertilizer. Does all of that make sense?
Great for the fertilizer company, I guess.
Great for the fertilizer company, exactly. Yeah. And I used to work for biopharmaceuticals, so they also have an agrochemical aspect to them. So going back to your question, how do they sense it? Well, they sense it. They sense a deficiency of nitrogen and then they work towards it. I don't really know how another tree senses that deficiency, and then I don't really know if that mechanism is really well understood, and it may well just be that I don't know. But I think we're in new territory. I mean, this is only 10-year-old research that we're talking about. So
it also seems amazing that the tree itself can know where the nitrogen is coming from anyway. I mean,
yeah,
if you think of something just absorbing something, you imagine there's no, there wouldn't be a differentiation between where that nitrogen is actually coming from. But
yeah.
You're suggesting it does very much know, because it stops supplying the sugars.
Well, I don't know if it can tell. Well, there are different types of nitrogen, firstly. So different types of nitrogen: fixed nitrogen, free nitrogen, and that's beyond the scope of this talk. But the idea is that it knows it's getting nitrogen from a source. So there are mechanisms within the tree which tell it that it no longer needs to feed any exudates in this direction. It's complicated stuff, but that's the physiology of the tree. It does it like that.
It's getting it without having to put anything back. So there's like no need, because it keeps getting what it needs already. So it doesn't need that relationship. It's getting it for nothing, essentially.
Yeah. Any questions on that point? We'll go here first. Are you still waiting to go, or
I'm going in 2 minutes.
do you want to go first? Go on.
Just how do we heal that? How do we heal the system?
Yeah, good question. So to heal it, you need to intentionally inoculate the soil again. So if I had like a sterile compost, municipal compost is usually sterilized, or if I had a dead soil, I would go into that forest, I would dig up some of the soil, and it would contain, a lot of mycorrhizal. It'll take it, and then I would go and introduce it in a responsible way. I'd dig it in, put it in, keep it moist, and that would. You can also buy mycelial, like granules of different mycelial strains, and then you can inoculate. So that's something for you to look into. Each time you plant a tree in your garden, or if you have any land and you're working with the land, it's a good idea to intentionally inoculate the soil or the roots. So I was doing some consulting for the Forestry Commission's nursery up in Delamere. Huge nursery, millions of trees at a time, and with the team there we made a whole plan, but one part of the plan was to intentionally inoculate each of the trees with a mycelial solution. So that's mycelial spores in solution, and you just literally dip the tree roots in it and then you plant it out, and that colonizes the fungal spores colonize the roots, and they're able to take over the roots and then establish a relationship, and that's much healthier for the tree in the long term. You could skip that step and fertilize those trees instead, but then you'd have to be continually fertilizing, and there are so many other functions that come with a mycorrhizal relationship, that symbiotic relationship. Good question. Excellent. Yeah.
Don't trees give out chemicals to identify things? So are they in relation then to the fungus and stuff? So it tells it like when to change colour and maybe it's unhappy. When you said the soil's dead, isn't it more dormant? Because bacteria and stuff and fungi, don't they just wait until conditions improve and just pop back up again?
Yeah, it can be like that. It can be like that. So if they're able to remain dormant and come back when the conditions are right, they will. So that's a really good point. And the lady also mentioned the chemical messaging. So there is the phenomenon of chemical messaging. So for example, the birch is a really good example. They send out volatile organic compounds, so VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And these are compounds that are released by the tree, and they're received by other trees. So it's a really good point. So they're received by other trees, and they can communicate stress in different ways. So it can be, for example, a disease or a pest or a pathogen, or even deer browsing can stimulate the release of these compounds, and then they can be received by downwind or however they travel by another tree, and then they can upregulate other compounds to prevent browsing. So that's a really good example. I don't know if those compounds are involved in this in basic nitrate sensing. I think that's a more fundamental. That's a slightly different concept, but it could well be something similar underground. Yeah. But the tree roots can always sense the nutrient. They're very, very excellent. It's like the digestive tract. It's like our own digestive tract. How do we know? If I asked you, how do you know which compounds to absorb when you're eating food? You just do it, because there are there are small and many different protein channels which can uptake many different types of compounds and of different sizes and different types. So it's like that. It's complex, beautifully complex, but it's like that. Yes. Mycorrhizal, yeah. Yeah, I would say yes, as long as the compost doesn't get too hot and kill it. It depends, because compost does generate heat. But you can. Yeah, there's no reason, if you've got compost that isn't going to get that hot, there's no reason why you can't do that. There's no reason why you can't do that. Yeah. Did you also have a question? No? Okay, yeah.
You talked about the symbiotic relationship, how the trees and fungi keep each other alive.
Yeah.
What about the fungi that decompose and take things apart? Where's
Excellent.
the relationship there in that?
Excellent, great question. So now we're going to move on from the symbiotic relationship to saprophytic fungi, or saprophytic fungi. So saprophytic fungi are responsible for. Did everyone hear what the gentleman asked? He asked, what about the fungi that break down organic matter? And that's a key part of this cycle, and it's one that we could talk a long time about. So now we're looking at life. That oak tree represents, very, very much a vitality, very much life. If that branch falls, what happens to that branch? It gets inoculated by a fungal spore. Saprophytic fungi, they release, so it's extracellular digestion. So they release many different enzymes that can break down lignin, they can break down cellulose, they can break down the structural components of a tree, which are usually, we call them recalcitrant, means that they stay regardless of weathering. So you can have a branch off the ground that stays like that for years, because it's not being inoculated, it's not being broken down by fungi, which requires moist conditions. In that case, it remains. Fungi recycle the organic material, and without that, you would have a very sick ecosystem. Without the death aspect and the death element, you wouldn't have. Feel free to contribute. You wouldn't have the nutrients available for plants to grow. So, back to the question: saprophytic fungi, they secrete enzymes to break down lignin, to break down cellulose, to break down pectins, to break down chitin. They are able to break down material into its constituent parts, and then they use that carbon. They use it as a food source. That's the relationship. Okay, so a lot of medicinal mushrooms that we'll be talking about in a bit, you grow it on wood chip, you grow it on straw, you grow them on the substrate that it grows on. The mycelium takes over, secretes those enzymes, breaks down the carbon trapped in those various structures, and then absorbs it and metabolizes it, and then that mycelium eventually will fruit, and then that's the mushroom that you get. And those mushrooms are what are collected and sold as mushroom powders or mushroom tinctures and functional mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, and that's what you've been drinking, which is pretty cool, I think. I hope you agree. But in the cola that you had, that's one of the main reasons why we're making that, is because we're supplementing you with medicinal mushrooms. We'll talk about the medicinal aspect in a second. Just to close off on the saprophytic aspect, which is a really, really great point. That's how you cycle nutrients in a forest ecosystem, and without that, you would get a build-up of material, organic material, and you'd get a depletion of nutrients. It wouldn't be sustainable. It wouldn't be functional. So, just a quick point on death and the taboo of death in our society. We don't really have time or space or energy to put towards death and death processes, or dark processes even. From a psychological perspective, dark processes are usually kind of, pushed to one side. And mushrooms and fungi are very much in the dark. That really is what they are. Literally and figuratively in the dark. And they belong to, and whichever language you want to use, they belong to the sacred feminine for the most part. They belong to the dark earth, and they're mysterious and they're beautiful, but they're hidden, and you need to go and look for it to make it to access it. But they hold secrets, like death. The knowledge of death and the understanding of death holds secrets, which gives you particular insights in life. And this is what happens at a forest ecosystem level. And I'm not going to talk more about this now, but at a forest ecosystem level, if you don't, whether we acknowledge it or not, those processes are happening anyway. But without those death processes occurring, there is no life, there is no health. There's definitely not health, and you won't have nutrients for life. So from life comes death. Lots more to say about it, but I would like you to say also a comment if you'd like to.
No, just the thing that came to mind is our conversation earlier that we were having together when we're talking about kind of the dark side of things, and how sometimes when you take from the natural world or from mushrooms and you expect it to give you health and healing, sometimes if you depend on it too much, the dark side of it is that, you know, you have to give something back in return. There's always a payment in some respect. So that's the only thing that came into my head.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we can talk about that perhaps at another talk or another time. But yeah, thank you for raising it and bringing that to the fore. Any questions about mushroom ecology in any way, shape or form? I think we're going to move on to the medicinal aspect of things soon. Go ahead.
Only a quick one. You said about when we use the fake nitrogen, it affects the environment. Does it just mean that this type of species of mushrooms change? So rather than mushrooms that help the trees, mushrooms that just break down, you know, the rotting stuff. Is that what happens?
Yeah, it can be. So any chemical change in the soil will affect the assemblage of organisms, microorganisms in the soil. So if you were to take a sample of soil, organic soil, you'd see a certain assemblage of microorganisms, including fungi. And if you were to take nitrogen treated soil, you'd see a different assemblage. And there would be a reduced number of mycorrhizal fungi in that soil because there's no need for them. Whether it means there's going to be more saprotrophic fungi or saprophytic fungi, I couldn't say. It depends how much organic matter there is in that system to break down for them to be there. But it's a good question. But definitely, any chemical amelioration, any chemical change that we make artificially will have a knock-on effect to the biology, which in turn will affect the chemistry and so on and so forth. But by a lot of the times, that's why now we're shifting. So I'm a chemist, now an ecologist, but that shift in thinking that we can in our own little very clever ways meddle and provide the perfect substrate for plants. It's a very arrogant way to think. Rather, if we're working with biology and microbiology and creating the environment and creating the conditions for those species to live, they will solve the chemistry in one way or another, and then we should be able to tell what's healthy soil from the biology and the chemistry, but as a proxy. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you want to ask?
You're saying how adding an inorganic fertilizer can create more native. If you're changing the chemistry by adding organic fertilizer, does that multiply as well? Ultimately, it's still changing chemistry, but is it always good, or do you have to be wary?
Great.
With an organic?
Yeah, good question. Well, the thing is with organic fertilizers, they have a mixture and a blend of elements and minerals. So the problem is really an excess of nitrogen and not anything else. So when we apply NPK fertilizer, nitrogen potassium phosphate fertilizer, that stimulates growth, but it doesn't allow assimilation of other nutrients and minerals. Yeah, if you do have a system that, well, it doesn't matter what the form is, an excess of nitrogen, and it will encourage decoupling. But usually when you have an organic fertilizer or an organic mulch or manure or something like that, it's usually not such an extremely high concentration of nitrogen. But the concept has come to be known because of that extremely high concentration of nitrogen. Yeah, and similarly in phosphates and other ways also phosphates. But that's a good question. It's beyond the scope of this, I think. But yeah, good question. The idea is balance, I think. If you're going to amend your soil, do it in a balanced way that mimics natural processes as much as possible. So manure, there's going to be a balance of nutrients. And chicken manure as well. I think we'll stop on the ecology aspect unless anyone has any more pressing. We've only got 20 minutes. So the medicinal species that we're using, so there are lots of different medicinal species of mushroom, and they all have their own activities and actions. So I'm interested in this as a pharmacist, as a herbalist. I finished researching the medicinal mushroom chaga. So I was working in the labs in Sweden, and that was what my thesis was about the medicinal mushroom chaga, and I was cultivating it and culturing it in labs there, in vitro. And very, very, very interesting things come to light during this research. One of them is if you are growing medicinal mushrooms on substrate that doesn't mimic their normal, doesn't mimic natural substrate, they may grow faster, and it relates to like fertilizing plants. They may grow faster, and primary metabolites, so fats, carbohydrates, sugars, these are primary metabolites. Secondary metabolites, triterpenes, phenols, such and such, which are a little bit more complex and more energy intensive biochemically to produce, but they have more interest. They have interesting actions. So the essential oils that you smell in a plant, or the taste, flavors, colors of any plant, these are all secondary metabolites. So if you see the foxgloves through there, that very vibrant pink color, that's a compound that's chemically synthesized, secondary to it growing. Okay, so it won't produce that color, that pigment, or a plant won't produce an essential oil if primary metabolism is hindered in any way. So that just makes sense. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you grow anything too fast, or just focusing on primary metabolism, so you're focusing on quantity, not quality, then you will have a reduction in secondary metabolite production. Secondary metabolites are almost always, when it comes to medicinal plants and medicinal fungi, they're almost always, that's what's responsible for the medicinal activity. That's not entirely true for fungi, but it is true for the triterpene content. For example, reishi, for example, chaga, they contain a triterpene fraction, which is the lanthanum-centered compound. Those compounds have anti-tumoric effects, so anti-cancer properties, anti-inflammatory properties, anti-diabetic properties, many properties, depending on the triterpene and the structure involved. But interestingly, they also have a primary metabolite, which is a polysaccharide, or a glucan molecule, which is a long chain, like a carbohydrate chain, which is also responsible for medicinal activity. So you find that in reishi again. You find that in most medicinal mushrooms, these polysaccharide structures. That's what they're made up of. And though when you take in a medicinal mushroom, actually most mushrooms, when you take in those mushrooms, we don't really know how, but they start to train the immune system at the gut level. So you can't absorb that polysaccharide, that polyglucan. We don't have because there are different types of chemical bonds that hold them together. There's beta glucan bonds. You can't really break them down because we're not evolved for that. But they do somehow train the immune system, and they've been associated with improved immune function. And that's research done in China by Wong et al. There's lots of different researchers looking at that, and I don't yet know the exact mechanism. As a pharmacist, I don't know the exact mechanism, but I do know that it's associated with improved and increased immune system function. And you can measure that in terms of upregulation of certain cells in the body, in the blood. You can measure that. So what I just wanted to demonstrate that a primary metabolite can also have a medicinal activity, and then you find that in the mushrooms, and also the secondary metabolites, which is in the triterpene function. So both of them come together, and they produce what we know as medicinal activity in mushrooms and fungi. We could talk a long time about the specifics. I would invite you to probably look at some books on it, or some research, and I can share my research with you if you like. Yeah, tell me, is there anything else I should mention on this? What's the time? Any questions about, there's going to be probably a lot of questions on this, so we've got 15 minutes. We'll go through any questions anyone has.
Why don't you talk about the adaptogenic effects of what's
Yeah, okay. Okay, if nobody has questions, we'll talk about, okay, then we have questions. Then after that we'll talk about this cola that you've tasted, what it takes to create that, why I've created it, what's the thinking behind it. Tomorrow we have a talk on herbal medicine, so it's going to be a little bit more on the medicinal aspect of these things, but also with vascular plants, so not just mushrooms. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of that product at the end of this talk, because it's very much related to fungi. Question? Great. Excellent. But wait, but I'm just going to stop you. I'm just going to repeat the question, and then I'm going to ask you for so the gentleman's asking, the medicinal mushrooms, what's the difference between lab-grown mushrooms and wild harvested mushrooms? Why does that differ? Secondly, what about the genetic diversity and the ability for biosynthesis of those compounds? And thirdly? Brilliant, good. Did everyone hear that bit? Yeah? Okay, so just steer me into the from one part to the next if I go off. So I'll direct it to my own research with chaga. Yeah, so that's the questions I was also asking. So the difference between lab grown and wild mushrooms is it's the substrate. So it comes back to you'll only get out what you put in. So the environmental conditions that something grows in will determine its vitality, but also its nutrient quality. Okay, so the genetics of the mushroom determine the biochemical processes that it can perform. So the genetics of the mushroom. So I'm going to say that again. The genetics of the mushroom determine the biochemical. What did I say? It determines the biochemical processes that it can. That's true for any organism. But the idea of epigenetics is the idea that environmental stimuli can turn on or off certain genes. So you call them. So each gene has a promoter region, and you can turn on a gene or off a gene environmentally. So just because an organism has a set of genes, it doesn't mean that it expresses them in its entirety, and it doesn't mean that that's independent of the environment. Actually, they're interplaying all the time. So to start the answer to the question is that. So you want to try in a lab, it's not possible to mimic, because just in the air, we'll go back to the volatile organic compounds. We don't know how a mushroom interacts with its ecosystem. We're so limited in our knowledge of ecology. It's so limited in terms of those interactions, and a lot of it we can't see. Some of it we can't hear. You know, I saw recent research of certain frequencies stimulating production of growth hormone in trees. So so everything's interacting with everything. So it's not possible to recreate the quality of a wild harvested thing. But what we can do. And I saw that in my own research, just quickly. So my research, I saw. And I'm not going to say it's statistically significant because it wasn't, because the study sample wasn't large enough. But what I saw was the faster growing strains which produce most biomass actually produce the least amount of melanin, which is a secondary metabolite. So the fastest growing one produced a compound in general, the least amount of medicinal compounds. So you grow it faster, you get a worse product medicinally. But if you're selling it and measuring it by weight, no one knows. So that's the issue. But that answers the first part of your question. Yeah? The second part of your question was.
Now it's more about how to bridge that gap. So creating a substrate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say we need to be much better at analyzing
analyzing the mushroom itself. So rather than just telling you, look, here's 50 grams of medicinal mushroom, now I want to know what micrograms or milligrams of triterpenes are in this. How do we standardize it? And a lot of medicinal preparations now, herbal medicines, they're standardized to a known bioactive compound. So let's say frankincense, you have this percentage of boswellic acids, or turmeric, this percentage of curcumin in this preparation, and that's only one compound. And I wanted to do something similar with my research in Sweden, but it wasn't possible. We didn't have the funding to do it. But the idea would be to say, let's just take the melanins in chaga. We want a sample to have at least 20% melanin content for it to be considered active, bioactive. That kind of idea. But then you have a whole library of compounds which are responsible for the medicinal activity. So what can you do reasonably? Reasonably, you can't say these are the compounds and this is the fluctuation, because how do you determine price based on a higher amount of triterpenes but a lower amount of polysaccharides? So it's very, very difficult. This is where the scientific modality breaks down. The scientific modality it requires one variable to change at a time. So it's very, very difficult. That's why when we're trying to use the left hemisphere, rational, logical, science mind, we break down and we can't handle it. We can't handle it. We can do like very, very, very complex statistics and mathematics now, like with lots of different regression analyses and all sorts of cool stuff. But essentially, it's very difficult when you work with multiple compound systems or multiple species systems. So it's the same thing when you're looking at, that's a really good point. When you're looking at a medicinal product that has multiple compounds, feel free to contribute, multiple compounds, it's the same difficulty as trying to assess a forest ecosystem with multiple species. Firstly, we don't know all the compounds that are there, so we can't even analyze them. And then we don't even know all the species that are there, never mind the interactions between them. So what I would say is, and I'd say my own education and my own journey, it's given me a lot, but at the end of it, mostly one must come with some humility to these processes, to these products, to these systems, must come with some humility, because we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're doing. For the most part, we can make educated guesses and we do as best as we can, but it must be a humility, some humility in it. Thank you for the questions. Excellent questions. Yeah, really good questions. Yeah, I will. Yeah, got 10 minutes. But yes, yeah. Okay, go.
As a layperson, to me, fungi and things like that seem like really powerful things. They're like hallucinogenics and they kill you.
Yeah.
So, is there a field of medicine now looking at those things? And as an ecologist and a pharmacist, do you see that, hopefully there are experts delicate relationship with them? To me, it seems really frightening that those things chopping trees down. Is that something that is going on in the modern traditional medicine?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So the lady asked the question: Is there a new discipline arising out of ecology and medicine to recognise these things? And yeah, I would say I know a few people and a few organisations. I don't know if it's a movement as such, but I do know that there are people looking at those interactions. Yeah, I do know that, and that's something I'm at the forefront of doing with my research. There is no research doing that, for example, with chaga. No one knows how, because it's so complicated. But there are people interested in it for sure. But it's a really good question. Yeah, and I think it's an invitation to use the right hemisphere a bit more, to use joined up thinking a little bit more, and get less used to using reductive kind of methodologies to find answers to things. I'm not sure what that really looks like, but yeah, good question. Yeah, we can talk about the future of this. Yeah, in another talk we could probably cover that. Yeah. It's a black sterile conch, usually found on birch. It's very valuable if you find it. I'll probably try and buy it off of you. Yeah, it's a black conch. It's sterile and it's like an eruption. It's a sclerotium. It's not spore producing. So if you go to a birch tree and you see a black conch, it's either, so it's an immune response, right? So chaga is different to the others. It's not a saprophytic fungi. It's a parasitic fungi, and it infects the birch tree via a wound. Doesn't kill it immediately. It contributes to its death inevitably, but it doesn't kill it. It takes over and it starts to digest the heartwood as a saprophytic. In the same way it secretes enzymes, and it's an extracellular digestion for the myceliums. From the mycelium's perspective, it starts to digest the heartwood of the tree. But before it kills the tree, it makes the tree erupt in these little sclerotium. I don't know what another term would be. Little black blobs that are like spiky black because of the melanin, and the melanin is one of the most potent antioxidants that we know of, which is related to its medicinal activity. So very, very good, very, very strong anti-cancer activity related to chaga, and that's from part related to. I'm definitely going to come back to you, but I'm going to go here first just because you had your hand up. Okay. Yeah. So no, they can. So the question was, can mushrooms die? And I think it's a good question. It's a fair question because we think these things should be infinite, and they're magical, infinite things that we can't really do anything to harm. And I think that's quite a dangerous. It's fair that you have that because they are quite, they're quite resilient. Yes. No, absolutely. There are hundreds of thousands of spores in the air right now from various fungi. So hundreds of thousands of spores, and you can hope that those spores can re-inoculate any given medium. So for sure, yes. But we don't know what library of spores there are in the air. So if we're depleting, so for example, I'm sure people said things similarly about flying insects. In the last 50 years, I may be wrong, but in the last 50 years we've lost 75% of our flying insects, and in this country, and I would have thought like nothing's going to take all these moths away. It's not possible for us to have such an effect. But when you're applying many tons of agrochemicals to any particular soil, it will start to degrade and deplete. So we can't rely on the resilience of these systems and these organisms, although we can't rely on them. But they do have an ability to come back. Yes, they do have an ability to some degree.
Out of all of the hundreds of thousands of millions or whatever mushrooms are there, do you have favourites?
I think my favourite's chaga, only because I've researched it. Yeah, but what's your favourite?
No, I don't know that I can answer that question, to be honest.
Which one do you feel drawn to?
There's one that looks like a little fairy toadstool, the fly agaric mushroom, just because, I don't know, it gives me a cosy feeling.
She didn't make the drink, so...
I didn't make the drink with that, that's okay, don't worry.
So the fly agaric, that's the amanita, that's a highly toxic,
My favourite.
That's her favourite. She's a dangerous one in the background. Do you want to say anything else, actually, before we close? Yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to finish. We've got 1 minute, so we'll quickly run through this. So we don't have this product to sell, unfortunately, but you can find it on the website. So this is a tonic. So the idea of a tonic is that it's an energy tonic. So it contains stimulant plants. So kola nut. The kola nut's a stimulant, but it's also, so that's the energy aspect to stimulate. But it also has adaptogenic plants. So ashwagandha. These are adaptogenic. Adaptogenic means that it tones and enhances various systems in the body at the same time. So it's not specific. It's not specific, but it's in general. And there are various mechanisms, just metabolic mechanisms for that. So, for example, ashwagandha has been shown to increase tolerance to oxidative stress in anaerobic exercise and aerobic exercise. So there are metabolic, basic physiological mechanisms that it affects and helps. So, and then in that is also the mushrooms, a mixture of different mushrooms. I haven't grown those mushrooms. She hasn't got involved either. But we bought these mushrooms for now. We are going to start growing our own mushrooms again. But those mushrooms are a selection of different medicinal mushrooms which have those properties that we mentioned earlier. I think we're expecting another talk here, but I would invite you to take a card, whether it's just out of interest or you're interested in the products or just interested in us. Robin is also got featuring on there with all my tea herbs, and I'm working in forest as forest medicine. So that's my consultancy, forest medicine, and we try and bring healing products and healing ideas and these kind of things. But I'm going to stop there because I think we have another talk coming. So I will allow that to come. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
I think the talk is a football game.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Your face